Assalamualaikum Mariam. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for coming in today.
What is the time right now? But conversation अच्छी थी पता नहीं चला time का बिल्कुल.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode of Pakistan Pivot. I'm Mariam Kiani, your host, and today I have with me Maha Kamal. Thank you so much for coming here. Maha is an international public policy specialist. She's worked for the past 9 years in communication and policy. She's associated with the Sustainable Development of Policy Institute and has authored extensively on policy and governance. She's a Chevening Scholar from the Queen's Mary University of London, where her dissertation received a distinction on the Paris Agreement and climate change. So today we're going to be talking to Maha Kamal about energy crisis, about climate change, and particularly under the thematic lens of security. I really look forward to having this conversation with you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Mariam.
Let's dive into just beginning by talking about the energy sector itself. So I want you to tell me about what the sector is, about what that looks like, and then we can kind of go on to talk about women in energy more.
So let's begin by dissecting how we understand energy security and how the traditional lens has evolved into having this more multidimensional aspect of energy security. So traditionally, we've understood energy security to be this uninterrupted supply of energy, so basically focused on the reliability of energy supply for a long period of time, right? And so now that uninterrupted availability has shifted to have this broader perspective where energy now overlaps with energy access that covers dimensions of human security as well, right? For example, we're talking about the fact that it's a human right to have access to, let's say, electricity, right? So that's number one. We have this focus on energy access. Then we also have a focus on climate, right? The way in which we are generating our electricity and larger energy supply, is that affecting other dimensions when it comes to, let's say, climate change or the way that we understand our planet itself, right? So now there are these other elements that spring out of that traditional understanding of energy security. Diving into what the energy sector itself looks like, the way in which it was previously understood, it's largely focused on, for example, different fossil fuels, right? Like the traditional focus when we talk about what we call this energy mix, what your energy sector looked like was oil, gas, coal, and then hydropower for Pakistan's context. But now we have this aspect of renewable energy now with solar, with wind, with biofuels coming up and hydrogen, so many other new technologies that are changing the landscape of how we understand energy itself, right? And so moving away from that fossil fuel heavy context, which was what the energy sector looked like, to these other cleaner sources of fuel is how we've seen this evolution as well. Previously, what was understood was that perhaps natural gas would be that transition fuel. It's cleaner than coal, cleaner than oil, that perhaps that would lead us to a greener, more climate-friendly energy sector, right? But increasingly what we're seeing now is the fact that if you look at it as a transition fuel, that's not really solving your larger problems, right, of climate change, of ensuring that uninterrupted supply of energy, specifically in Pakistan's context with the recent gas crisis, which emerges every winter for Pakistan, right? Yeah. And so given all of these contexts, it's imperative that the landscape itself changes and that the sector itself evolves to be greener and cleaner.
Right. You're talking about evolution of the sector, and in that gender is a big part. Tell me about women in energy. In that particularly, you're co-chairing the organization here in Islamabad. We have a very fantastic women-led team, which is of Women in Energy. I want to understand for you to tell me and the audience, is it something about, is the conversation around it rather that we need to do women empowerment, and so women energy is one place where you need to do it? Or do you think it's more than that, where it extends to how there's perhaps a link to energy and to women's economic development? So, how really is that understanding of the concept behind women in energy? Why do you think it's important, and why do you think what is it that it's doing?
Absolutely. So great question. And something that I'm very passionate about. So Women in Energy actually started off back in 2018, and it happened very organically. A number of us who were the founding members of Women in Energy were a part of the sector, and we realized that if it's not only a male-dominated sector, but that opportunities for growth were inhibited because women weren't getting access to the kind of professional development and mentorship that is actually necessary for that, for climbing the career ladder in the sector. And so what started off as a network for professional women just connecting each other has now evolved into a substantial organization that focuses not just on professional development, but also we ensure that there's a healthy representation of women in the sector and that gender equity is at the heart of what we do. And so when it comes to the question of energy and gender, that's actually when we actually look at different studies, there's actually quantitative evidence that shows that women who have access to mentorship are increasingly in positions of leadership than later on in the field as well. And when women are in a position of leadership, then other younger women have access to these role models that they can then mirror and actually begin to climb that ladder, right? Because previously, when we pointed out, for example, if there's a male-heavy panel, what used to happen was that the criticism that we used to get is that, oh, there are not enough women in the energy sector, right? But that was simply not true. The women were sometimes younger, early career, mid-career, but because they didn't have access to those role models and that mentorship.
They were rather invisibilized.
Yes. And so because they weren't, it became a circular problem, a chicken egg problem rather, right? Because they weren't getting access to those mentors, they weren't in those positions of leadership, and then the cycle continues. And so what we wanted to do was fill in that gap, understand the energy industry needs, what was really imperative, what kind of skills were necessary for women to progress in the sector, and then connect with the resources that they needed to develop those skills. So that's at the heart of what we do.
And so that's in terms of from like an organizational point of view, that's where you're coming in, thinking about why it's important for women to receive this certain mentorship and to be able to then be a voice in conversations that happen around energy. So then the next step would be that if you now have these female voices who are understanding energy, who are understanding the energy crisis, who are understanding energy security, then does that mean the way it will be understood and implemented will change because you have a gendered aspect to it now? And in that, I want to particularly understand if it's just about, there should be gender equity, male-dominated industries हैं, energy भी एक male-dominated industry है, तो हम इसको gender balanced करते हैं या वो. Is it just that, or do you think it does extend to that there is a link between access to energy for women to women's economic development?
Yeah. So at the heart of it, it's not just a question of gender balance, right? At the heart of it all, the diversity matters because when you have other stakeholders at the table, women, other minority groups, and have a more inclusive energy sector, what happens is that the needs that are previously ignored and the problem itself, the nature of the problem changes, right? Like, for example, if we understand the very nature of energy security changes as well, right? Like, for example, what I'm saying is that when a sector, for example, is male-dominated, then you stick to those traditional definitions of energy security as well, right?
Okay.
You might just focus on creating that reliability of supply and not necessarily focus on how that supply is actually being created. Is it cleaner? Is it going to impact minority groups, for example? Is it going to create energy access for all rather than just specific groups? So it then becomes a very intersectional question then, right? It crosses questions of gender, class, and other issues as well. And so when you bring in other stakeholders to the table, not just women, and other, just making the sector itself more inclusive, that creates a healthier, more equitable energy sector for all. And then the energy policy that you're going to bring into the table is then going to evolve over time as well. So if you look at it from a very macro perspective, you're bringing in those elements that didn't previously exist. So it's not just a question of creating gender balance. That is one facet of the problem, but there are other aspects to it. And like I said, the very nature of how you're going to conceive energy security will change.
Yeah. And this reminds me actually of, I believe it's a study that was done in Brazil in which they showed how women's access to power, which is like gas or electricity, increased their income and so increased their lifestyle. How all of this is linked to, say, poverty lines, to just economic development and general living standards of a society. And in that, of course, you can't really ignore a great portion of the population, which is the women, or which is in fact even other minorities that tend to be ignored in such discussions. So that's why I think also women in energy particularly interested me in seeing your passionate work for it, and the teams as well.
And so the study you've shared actually reminds me of the whole problem of bargaining power, right? When you look at households and try to understand household energy consumption, there's often the aspect of who's the decision maker in this situation, right? If the household itself is going to be dominated by men, then necessarily they might make different decisions when it comes to their energy consumption, right? So the whole problem of cleaner fuel, that impacts women's lives more generally. Their health is affected if they don't have access to that cleaner fuel. And then largely because the way traditional households are constructed, if women are doing most of the cooking, then their health is greatly impacted. So there are all of these other facets that we can think of, these sub-problems that we can conceive of. Right. And that changes when you bring women to the decision-making table and they're part of the policy-making process, which is our ultimate goal.
Right, Jalen. That's really nice to hear. I think let's move on to particularly the gas crisis in Pakistan. So we've seen how earlier in August last year, Pakistan purchased the costliest gas in its history till date, and we saw a lot of outrage. We saw there was an global gas crisis, and in that, of course, while that global gas crisis shortage is happening in Pakistan, you're seeing how there is not correct estimates done of demand, and which is why then you're leading to having to jump to last minute tenders, and that's creating further pressure on your economy. It's not solving the crisis. So it's just a lot of coupled with all of this. You've worked a lot in terms of the links between governance and energy. So I want you to kind of explain to me from a very just to kind of jump into this conversation, and then we can go into the details of it as well, how you understand this particular crisis in Pakistan from that point of view.
Absolutely. So our gas crisis and our larger energy crisis are actually, you rightly pointed out, are questions of governance then, right? And largely how you're managing everything. What I have realized over these about a decade in this sector is that there's a lot of inter-ministerial coordination that needs to be improved, improving the way in which the departments coordinate between each other. That definitely has an impact on how the sector is managed, right? What we've seen time and time again whenever we are in a crisis situation is that there seems to be a blame game that emerges. Ministries are going to blame departments are going to blame ministries. Ministry of Finance sometimes comes up as not being able to solve our circular debt problem. And all of these, at the heart of it, are governance issues, right? They're not necessarily questions of the fact that does Pakistan have gas or not, or have we signed a contract that has led to us getting expensive gas. It's a question of are you able to forecast your needs correctly, but also your vision itself. A lot of times that we've seen is that the decisions that are made in energy are very short-term focused, right? Like, for example, when our long-term contract with Qatar was signed, there was a lot of criticism at that time that it should not have been linked to oil. It should instead have been linked, the way in which that index was constructed could have been constructed differently so as to avoid having that volatility or that price volatility that if suddenly oil price shoots up, it's going to impact that gas price, and then that necessarily has an impact of how much gas you're able to then consume, right? And then the question was, should you just buy it at the spot market? Yeah. But if you buy it at the spot market, even though you're going to get a good price when there is oversupply, you're not going to be able to secure a good price when there's undersupply, and not to mention it's going to impact the availability of that gas, right? And so you're right, absolutely, that the forecasting needs to be correct, and greater reliance on what we call this evidence-based policy making, right? The fact that we need more data to be able to support our decisions instead of decisions being impacted by the political economy of it all. So that's something that's at the heart of the governance crisis.
And in that, do you think, for example, a conversation that I've kind of read around on the internet these days more is about the question of LNG being switched to private stakeholders. And in that, what the understanding is that as when you privatize, there's greater competition, there's greater incentive. And so perhaps that could be one way to govern the system to kind of, maybe take out the loopholes. That's one, Another is that where the energy minister tells us that the problem is in the domestic, so he's like, this can't be put into pipes. If you kind of understand energy and the 3 stages it goes through, which is production, transportation, distribution, and then consumption, where do you think is the problem? Do you think it's in all of these areas? Do you think it's a chain that we're not having a good enough understanding of that's leading to it? What is it really?
Yeah. So let's just talk about gas and electricity both, because these are connected issues here. When it comes to gas, absolutely, a lot of the problem is what we have a problem of a leaking bucket. The efficiency in how we use natural gas is a huge problem. And so we have a problem of unaccounted for gas, for example, the way in which our piped gas is supplied. There's a lot of it that's just simply lost. And if we were getting it at such an expensive price, then that's just wasted dollars, right? Yeah. So that's the problem of unaccounted for gas, the problem of the fact that if you don't have efficient, let's say your gas turbines, if they're operating inefficiently, and that's where a lot of criticism comes to the GenCos, for example, the generating companies, and the fact that if they're not operating very efficiently, then that's gas that's wasted. When it comes to IPPs, sometimes you're in contracts that are long term, and then if gas is, for example, not being used, then you still have to pay for it, right? Which is another problem that we have in the sector. And so there's all of these multiple sector, from a policy perspective, you can call those inefficiencies itself, but from an energy perspective, the way in which we understand efficiency is how you're going to use that fuel in order to meet your energy needs, right? So that's the gas problem. Similarly, in the electricity sector, we have a similar problem, right? So we have electricity sometimes, but the transmission and distribution lines is where electricity gets lost. Then there's the problem of the fact that when you're generating electricity from inefficient fuels, like for example, if your energy sector, if it's dependent on oil, then that's not really the most efficient way to do things, right? And so all of these problems are really interlinked. And at the heart of it all is realizing that your sector needs to evolve over time and it needs to be upgraded. There's a lot of talk about retrofitting your turbines, for example, making sure that you do the requisite maintenance at the right time so that you don't really have to replace that entire technology. Yeah, right. So all of it is part of that management issue.
Right. And in this evolution of technology that you're talking about, it actually does remind me of this larger question of technology, which is we could talk about this briefly, and then I do have a few more questions on energy as well. With technology and energy, technology in policy, technology in governance, how do you see from like in the energy sector particularly, as we're speaking now, if technology you think could be a tool that could be used by countries like Pakistan, developing countries, to kind of catch up on countries that have been direct recipients of the benefit of the Industrial Revolution, for example? Do you think in a general sense, when we have this conversation of technology for developing countries kind of doing that, where do you think that kind of fits with energy sector?
Yeah, this is actually a great question, and it actually brings us to CPEC as well, right? When we were talking about there being this greater investment in the energy sector, there was a lot of talk about technology sharing and upgrading Pakistan's own existing energy technology needs, right? But what ends up happening is that sometimes the technology that you have access to is so costly that, and if you're not getting it in a grant form, if it's in a loan form, that actually ends up really impacting our debt crisis, right? Because energy itself, really, the kind of investments are very heavy, right? And a lot of times that's why you're in long-term contracts for a lot of energy needs, right? Like, for example, when it comes to gas, we come up with the idea of take or pay. That is, you're in this long-term contract, so you have to take that gas regardless of if you use it or not. Similarly, we have seen in the IPPs as well, these are long-term contracts. That's specifically because the kind of investments that you need in the energy sector are so heavy that it ends up impacting our debt problem and our larger economy as a whole, right? The fact that energy itself is such a significant portion of the economy. So that's really problematic itself. But of course, you're right that if you have access to the to the right technology, that means that you're going to be able to, what I was referring to earlier, you're going to have that energy efficiency that is going to lead to savings. And so that becomes a question of, it's a policy question, opportunity cost at the moment, right? That do you want to incur that short-term heavy investment to have long-term savings, right? And oftentimes, perhaps you don't necessarily have access to capital as a developing country to be able to secure that early investment. So you end up being locked into an older technology, which is not necessarily efficient.
We're talking about losses and, how you kind of have to cut certain, bear certain losses to be able to come to a point where, like, just because you haven't had that head start as a developing country, perhaps, of course, including other factors. And that reminds me of just a few days ago, there was this news about how the textile industry in Pakistan suffered around $250 billion of loss in their textile exports just in last month alone. And that essentially is a problem of energy, because the association tells that it's because the ministry did not give us the fuel we needed. We were not able to produce, and we kind of... So just the link between energy and development now, because if it's affecting your industries, how do you see this? Like, then it just really, where do you think is the problem? How do we need solutions that are really being able to tackle all of this?
Absolutely. So that reminds me of a phrase that we often use in the energy sector, is that energy is the engine of economic growth, right? At the heart of it all, you're right that there ties with the economy and larger questions of development, right? Having access to energy, for example, means that you're going to then be able to go towards that road of economic development. But then having sustainable energy access, that means that it's not just reliable, but cleaner, means that you've secured your long-term future as well, right? You're right, and when you mentioned the textile crisis as well, is the fact that when it comes to allocating gas, that then becomes a question of governance, right? And then we often have this problem of what we call merit order as well. Like, for example, giving greater gas to those that are running most efficiently, right? So there are all of these sub-problems that you've identified, but at the umbrella topic would then just be governance, which we've already discussed.
Right. I think that's kind of a good conversation we've had in terms of energy, just the kind of questions I was interested to know about. We could now of course, it's linked in terms of governance, development. We could talk about the climate change. In that, of course, we'll then again also talk about renewable and non-renewables. But just... as of now, you're seeing how climate issue is an issue of today. It's an issue of now. It's not just in Pakistan, it's across the world. And there's a great understanding of the urgency of it as well. But what are we really doing about it, in the sense that you've seen just the impacts of it from the floods that have happened in Europe. You've seen the wildfires in the US. In Pakistan, Swat floods every year since the past decade, I believe. There's heat waves in Karachi that happens every year. There's smog in Lahore, there's droughts in Thar. So there's, in Pakistan particularly, you're seeing how there's become a great permanence to these issues of climate change, and that you almost also just perhaps accept them as a seasonal thing, there's really and people die, we're losing lives in this. I want to understand, you've done a lot of work on the Paris Agreement, on COP26, I want to understand, I want you to go into detail to kind of, tell me here what the issue is in terms of its stages in adaptation, mitigation, or financing, mitigation, adaptation, and financing. Where is the world standing on it? Where is Pakistan standing on it? And what really is the climate issue right now?
Great. So excellent question, and one that really is an umbrella issue at the heart of it, right? Like, for example, if we look at energy, we're talking about a sub-problem that has other aspects to it, but climate is that one issue that you can really understand as that umbrella that is really going to permeate all issues, right? Which is why increasingly we now understand climate security to be a human security issues, right? The fact that what you've mentioned in Pakistan specifically shows the fact that there's a lot of the issue at hand is of climate vulnerability as well, right? The countries that have perhaps not really they haven't really undergone industrial development in the same way that a lot of developed countries have, but at the same time are now the most vulnerable, right? When it comes to carbon emissions. Like, for example, Pakistan has oftentimes been ranked, recently it was ranked number 5 on the Climate Vulnerability Index, right? Which shows that the way that in which our human lives in Pakistan are going to be impacted by climate is going to be increasingly more difficult, not only in just terms of that loss of human life, but it has an economic angle to it. It has this huge economic repercussion, and the fact that we have now kind of accepted it as a seasonal problem. Whereas that's not necessarily the case, right? Climate being this wicked problem is an issue that is going to permeate everything. And when it comes to understanding climate security as a human security issue, we need to understand that we need to have stringent regulation, stringent guidelines that are going to impact all of our sector, right? What's encouraging is the fact that Pakistan has recently submitted its nationally determined contribution, the NDC document, under the Paris Agreement, and that's a really good comprehensive first step towards doing the right thing when it comes to our climate policy, right? We are going to be able to overall have this holistic understanding of what are the kind of changes that are needed in our economy to be able to meet our climate change goals, right? But that's from a perspective of a developing country. What Pakistan needs at the moment is, you rightly pointed out, access to climate finance and having those opportunities where Pakistan is able to swiftly evolve its economy to be able to meet the climate needs, but also the fact that it needs to be able to not only adapt to the climate crisis, but be able to mitigate that risk as well, right? When it comes to carbon emissions, lower our carbon emissions, but we need to be mindful of the fact that Pakistan is not a leading country when it comes to carbon emissions itself, right? Yes, we have a significant portion of it, but not as much as the top 5 highest carbon emitting countries, at the top of it being China and the US, right, who are considered to be the countries that are the biggest polluters, right? And so the decisions that are going to be made at the developed country level are going to impact our Pakistani human lives, right? And so at the heart of it, understanding the climate problem is going to be overall understanding that it's a multidimensional problem. It's a wicked problem, which means that the aspects that we need to understand are the fact that there needs to be an evolution and an understanding of climate as an issue that permeates everything. So that's at the heart of it.
And when you talk about how like China and US are the biggest polluters, and in terms of how that does not necessarily mean they're the most vulnerable to climate, the issue of climate. In that, there's, I believe this year around, I was closely following COP26, the conversations happening around it in academia, in think tanks, and then even from a policy point of view, how people were writing about it. And I did think there was greater talk about how there is a divide between the two, between the responsibility and the vulnerability, which is, I believe, really important in terms of how you understand, and which is why then the financing part of the COP26 becomes important. Do you think that's something that we're working towards, that these big countries, the developed world, is trying to understand about the fund? If you could talk about, and what is the kind of shared role then, if the problems are unique as per different countries, and if their interests are not necessarily the exact same, then how can we really move forward in a way that understands this to be a global issue and then needing a global policy?
Yeah. So, Mariam, at the heart of it, when it comes to the Paris Agreement as well and the Paris framework, the phrase that we often use is common but differentiated responsibilities, right?
Okay.
It's the fact that climate change itself is a global issue that's going to affect the globe entirely, right? Not necessarily one country. And so then the fact remains that should you approach it from that lens of sovereignty, is it a question of nation states making their independent decisions? But the fact that it's going to impact everyone's lives means that it's that global issue that requires a global solution, right? But the way that Paris is constructed means that every country submits the NDC, which is their nationally determined contribution, which is their country-specific set of goals towards climate change that ultimately has to lead towards fulfilling that global common goal, which is that you have to ensure that your carbon emissions are within that. Basically, the goal is it stays within that 2-degree limit, the global warming itself. And then 1.5 degree is often talked about as well as that being that limit. There's a lot of contention and a lot of debate whether you should even bring up 1.5 in
if
this.
That's even possible anymore.
Yeah. So the fact remains that the 2 degrees, what we ultimately want to focus on, that you have to limit it within that. And it's really going to, what's really scary about climate change is that even the science itself, when you look at the Interpanel Governmental Committee on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is like the scientific body responsible for collecting and coordinating all of the information on climate change, what's really scary is that when we talk about climate change, there's a lot that scientists say that it could lead us to the tipping point. And what they mean by the tipping point is that we could reach a point in which we could kind of be in this dominoes effect of climate change where it just one problem leads to another, to the fact that you won't be able to control it anymore. And so that's at the heart of it, is something that as a global community we really want to avoid. And so it's not a question then of countries taking a very nationalistic stand on what's possible, what is not, because it's a global crisis, right? And so it becomes a question of an emergency. Right. And so we've often seen that being stressed at COP26 as well, the fact that it is an emergency, that there needs to be action, that the action that's been taken isn't necessarily enough. But then we saw the outcome after COP26. There was a lot of disappointment among climate activists that not enough was achieved, not enough was done, that perhaps the fossil fuel lobby still had a big presence in COP26. So there are all of these interconnected issues. But the fact remains that climate change, being a global problem, requires a bottom-up solution that essentially individuals working in their communities are going to be the most vulnerable, right? And so they need to have a voice at COP26 and towards the climate solution.
Right. And you use the word emergency, and we've seen how it's been used at COP26, so it's been used at global macro forums like these. But if we were to talk, say, about like Pakistan particularly, do you think there is a need for the government to impose climate emergency? Do you think that is a thing that matters really, if you say, okay, we're now in a state of climate emergency? Do you think that changes the way then you govern and you make policy, and then even how you perhaps understand smog or heat waves? Do you think that's something that needs to be done?
Absolutely. So framing matters, right, when it comes to policy. What is encouraging is the fact that what I've told you earlier as well is that Pakistan has submitted a document that does look like we are headed towards a national action plan on climate that is supposedly encouraging, right? So there is cognizance of the fact that we are in a state of climate, in a climate crisis, not necessarily an emergency at the moment. What would be interesting from Pakistan's perspective is the fact that Pakistan is dealing with a lot of other crises at the moment as well, right? Like, for example, we already have an energy crisis at hand. We have, for example, other very important development issues that are oftentimes what you can call an emergency as well, right? So framing it as an emergency would oftentimes not really be that helpful for Pakistan's specific context because we have so many other crises at hand as well. But at the same time, having that understanding and that cognizance of the fact that this climate change problem is going to be permeating all of our sectors and impact not only our energy policy, but also our economic policy, our development trajectory, and really impact the way we understand planning and development itself, right? So a good way in which to conceive this problem would perhaps be what is the status quo is that it's understood as a problem of sustainable development, right? So oftentimes the reference point is then the sustainable development goals, in which poverty is number one, so on and so forth. And SDG 13 is when we talk about climate change and climate action, right? And so keeping in mind that for developing countries, perhaps contextualizing it as a problem of sustainable development is oftentimes more helpful. But when it comes to the biggest emitters, in that regard, there's a need from developing countries to push forth that notion of climate emergency.
Right. In this, I also want to talk about renewable energy and non-renewable energy because coal is one of the biggest, topics that you talk about whenever there's such conferences. Even generally, who has these China cut down. China said it's no longer going to have functional coal production places, and so just like it's like okay, this is like maybe now China, apart from all that Cold War rivalry where you had okay, China is also stepping up. There's greater sense of understanding this as a problem in Pakistan as well. You have this repeated question of why do we keep on using coal and why are we not able to switch to renewable energy resources? We've seen Spain build a capacity where it can fully transition to a renewable. We've seen UAE kind of build that capacity for themselves. India is doing similar projects. Do you think I keep going back to the question of what is the problem, if it's that we're not having enough understanding, if it's that we have structural issues, if it's that there is issues of governance, if it's issues of technology, it's like a lot of these. So I keep going back to that, and here also I want to understand why is it that we're not able to move to a renewable? Do you think it's structural corruption? Do you think it's any of that? I mean, not to discount the fact that there is great work that's being done to kind of nationally, understand that we are in a crisis and that, in terms of plantation, deforestation, just greater ownership of that. But in terms of, just coal energy linked to our crisis and all of that, just tell me a bit about that.
Absolutely. So, Mariam, what's fascinating is that Pakistan, especially when it came to generating electricity, did not have a lot of dependence on coal until, in fact, we don't have a dependence on coal for electricity, while we do focus on it for other energy needs, right? We had a large dependency on on crude oil, which is a fossil fuel, and then natural gas. So about 60% of our energy needs were being met by oil and gas specifically, right? And coal became this recent emergent that we're seeing, specifically because there was a lot of focus on developing our own indigenous natural resources on coal to be able to exploit those. And it has come very belatedly at a time when everyone is moving away from coal, is when we have decided that we need to exploit this natural resource of ours, right? And so recently you must have heard Prime Minister Imran Khan has also said that we're not going to be focused, and no new project is going to focus on imported coal, for example, right? So we have come up with that as basically putting an end to that potential dependency. But at the same time, there's a lot of pressure when it comes to exploiting something that is considered an indigenous resource, particularly our thar coal is what we have in mind here, right? The problem at hand is that when it comes to coal, you often hear people talking about, for example, clean coal and technologies that can potentially limit the emissions. But all of that is, I think, a way of really not understanding the heart of the problem, which is that when you have access to better technologies, for example, renewable energy, specifically when it comes to solar energy, actually reached parity with coal in terms of the economic cost of solar a long time ago. India reached it in 2013, for example, right? And so when you have that parity, when you know that you're going to be able to generate the same energy that you're going to be able to when you are focused on coal, so you really have that potential to move away from it, right? And so why not really take that path, right? Previously, the idea was that solar and wind aren't necessarily that cost effective, but now in 2022, we have reached a point where these solutions can be cost effective. That the capacity factor problem has improved, which means that the fact that you have access to greater efficiency when it comes to solar panels and solar technologies. Similarly with wind, and given the fact that Pakistan has so much potential when it comes to solar, when it comes to wind, even microhydel. So you see that there can be that path towards greater renewable energy, and one that is, I think, again encouraging from our NDC.
Right. I think this could perhaps be my last question. I don't want to skip on this because I do want to talk about in terms of when we talk about climate change, perhaps even when we talk about energy crisis, how both of these are linked to economic justice, the concept of economic justice, how certain class in a certain society suffers differently from these issues.
Yeah.
So just to be able to have a more, you talked about earlier, just an intersectional lens that needs to be applied to the energy sector. Similarly, when you talk about climate, of course, there's this conversation about how between countries, within countries, there's this difference that you talked about. The Paris Agreement talks about it. But even within country, there are certain issues that are very unique to the lower class, which is in terms of displacement, which is in terms of flooding and you lose your houses, which is in terms of heat waves in Karachi and you see hundreds of people lose their lives in that. It's a certain class that is suffering and not another class. And then, of course, it is linked to the question of economic justice. Why do you think, if any, do you think this is an important conversation to have? And where do you think this fits? What do you think is needed in Pakistan's context, I'm speaking, to be able to, kind of understand this in a better way?
Excellent question. So, Mariam, you rightly pointed out that it's a question of economic justice, but we also use the term climate justice as well. The fact that the most vulnerable communities, the most vulnerable people aren't necessarily at the decision-making table when it comes to making decisions on climate policy, on economic policy, on energy policy. So, first of all, giving most vulnerable communities a seat at the table, making them a stakeholder, and that leads to what I was telling you earlier about it being a bottom-up solution where you are essentially involving the stakeholders that are going to be impacted the most in creating solutions for their communities. But also what is really important is that it really becomes a question of humanizing the problem, right? The fact that we need to understand that climate change is not necessarily an abstract problem of just carbon emissions creating a rise in global temperatures, but it's the fact that people are losing their homes, losing their lives, losing their livelihoods as a result of the climate problem, right? And so at the heart of it, it becomes a question of climate justice and how we perceive this issue really it's a question about vulnerability. It becomes a question of sustainable development and really giving access to energy, to economic livelihoods that really doesn't impact the climate change problem, right? Because climate change is not necessarily an abstract problem in that regard. It's a real human problem impacting lives, and there needs to be a greater cognizance of that within policy circles.
And in that, do you think then it's not just, when you say it's not just, it's all linked to climate justice, do you think governance is another way in which you could possibly then, heat waves is a climate issue, but people dying because of heat waves is a governance issue? Do you think that's something that
Absolutely. When it comes to understanding climate change, there are generally two aspects of mitigation and adaptation, right? Creating that framework in which you're protecting the most vulnerable is at the heart of it a governance problem,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so it would be imperative that Pakistan's national action plan when it comes to climate, its provincial action plans are all aligning to that vision where climate justice is accounted for, that the most vulnerable is taken care of. And that would require not just giving the most vulnerable a seat at the table, but having a greater understanding and cognizance of the kind of impact that is going to be created by climate change.
Right. Thank you so much, Maha Kamal, for your time. It was a lovely conversation and truly great insight for me. It was I was able to learn a lot from you during this. So thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this. And that's it from today's episode of the Pakistan Pivot. For those of you who are watching, I would like you to please let us know what you think about this conversation down below in the comments. Do like, share, and spread around for greater engagement on our channel so we're able to do this more often. And also do let me know the kind of conversations that you'd like us to have in the future. Thank you.